Greetings and salutations, my fellow primal movers and enthusiasts. Welcome to my channel. My name is Oscar Perez. I'm a movement specialist, coach, and the founder of Primal Kinetics Training System. This video is dedicated to my beef with veganism. If the entire population of planet Earth switches to eating only vegetables, fruits, plants, it is not only going to be a healthcare issue, it's going to be an environmental nightmare. Everybody eating plants only, it is not sustainable, plain and simple, and I'm going to explain why. We first must understand that industrialized agriculture, which uses chemicals to maintain their crops, harms wildlife directly and indirectly. So, in order to avoid these foods, we ought to embrace organic or subsistence agriculture. But a problem arises. If we cannot farm animals, where do we find a source of fertility for growing crops? Plant-sourced protein requires tillage, which depletes the soil by oxygenating it. This destabilizes soil microbiology whilst burning organic matter. The plants themselves will also be taking part of their mass from the soil in the form of minerals and other micronutrients. This problem is exacerbated with the practice of monocropping. But even with crop rotation and other traditional farming strategies, the problem of topsoil depletion cannot be solved. It will only delay the loss. For the fields to be sustained, there has to be a fertility input. Traditionally, this is composted manure. We have been using this for thousands of years. But if we go the vegan way, this would no longer be available. We would somehow harvest vegetation like grass and compost it. This would be very difficult, almost impossible, without livestock ingesting it and inoculating it with microbiology, which is very necessary. And it is also very expensive if there were no fattened animals to sell when the composting process is over. This will impact the economy in unimaginable ways to the point of collapse. For example, composting the straw from the grain crop without feeding it to a cow or mixing it with manure can take many years. There will be mountains of straw everywhere. Without a market for straw, grain farmers must increase the cost of their product in order to make it profitable. But this is just the beginning of the agricultural chaos that will ensue. Not only that, with no animals in the farm to make good use of spoiling produce, resulting in even more inefficiency, the soil will continue to deplete until erosion, crop failures, and food shortages became common. Protein from pastured animals, on the other hand, returns fertility to the soil. A properly managed grassland pasture sequesters more carbon than even the most vibrant forest. Grass is perennial, requiring no tillage, and is constantly converting carbon dioxide into plant tissue. When the grazing animal eats the grass, composts it in its rumen, and returns it to the earth, that carbon is bound to the soil. These animals restore life to the soil by adding carbon and other trace nutrients and microbiology. They are the balance to the damage caused by annual vegetation and the tillage it requires. There must be a balance, and this balance must not be disturbed for a sustainable and efficient agriculture. The veganist movement wants to tamper with this delicate balance, and we must not allow it. Another matter that needs to be understood is that there is a difference between the good of the chicken, for example, and the life of a chicken. Eating a chicken is not us profiting and or exploiting it, because chickens are also as a whole receiving a benefit from us. We provide for their needs, we give them shelter, food, and safety from predators. They are in fact profiting from us as well. Besides, Who is going to volunteer to keep every heritage breed of chickens as pets and receiving nothing in return? Probably nobody. Some people claim that if everyone stops eating chickens, they will go extinct. Chickens are perpetuated by their eventual consumption. I did some research about this and did not find anything to support this claim, but in hindsight, it makes some sense. I will go probably into more detail in a future video. There's not a single natural ecosystem that does not require death and consumption on some level. And that, my friends, is order. Should we intervene every time a wolf or predator kills an innocent deer for the benefit? Wolves need to eat too, and they are carnivores. In exchange for this loss, the herd is corralled and herded toward new pastures by predatory pressure. Otherwise, they would overgraze their surroundings, causing starvation and damage to that ecosystem. In the end, death is not the problem. Creating an imbalance is. And sadly, for vegans, they cause an imbalance. I'm going to use Australia as an example to make my case. Published figures suggest that in Australia, producing wheat and other grains results in 1. At least 25 times more sentient animals being killed per kilogram of usable protein. 2. More environmental damage. And 3. A great deal more animal cruelty than does farming cows for meat and or dairy. This happens because producing wheat, rice, and pulses requires clear-felling native vegetation. That act alone results in the death of thousands of animals and plants per hectare. Since the introduction of commercial agriculture in Australia, there has been a loss of more than half of its native vegetation, mostly to increase production of monocultures of introduced species for human consumption. Most cattle slaughtered in Australia feed solely on pasture. This is usually rangelands, which constitutes about 70% of the continent. As I mentioned before, grazing occurs on primarily native ecosystems. The rangelands cannot be used to produce crops, so the production of meat here does not limit production of plant foods. So, grazing is the only way humans can find substantial nutrients from 70% of the continent. Let us crush some numbers. 70% of the beef produced for human consumption in Australia comes from animals raised on grazing lands with very little to no grain supplements. 2/3 of cattle slaughtered feed solely on pasture. Now, to produce protein from grazing beef, cattle are instantly killed. One death delivers on average a carcass of about 288 kilograms. This is approximately 68% boneless meat, which at 23% protein equals 45 kilograms of protein per animal killed. Therefore, 2.2 animals killed for each 100 kilograms of usable animal protein produced. Compare that to at least 100 mice are killed per hectare per year to grow grain. Average yields are about 1.4 tons of wheat per hectare. 13% of the wheat is usable protein. Ha! Notwithstanding, at least 55 sentient animals die to produce 100 kilograms of usable plant protein. Replacing red meat with grain products leads to many more sentient animal deaths, far greater animal suffering, and significantly more environmental degradation. It is more humane, ethical, and environmentally friendly to eat beef from grazing animals. Vegans claim that most crops are used to feed animals, and that is a lie. Actually, only 36% of crops are used to feed animals around the world. 9% is used for other practices like biofuels. In the US, 67%, which is all the soy farmed in the Midwest, goes to animal feed. Imagine what can be accomplished if we can revert that here in the United States. On a side note, whilst we may think of an industrial agriculture as a relatively new phenomenon, our country was built on an ever-expanding farming methods. From southern cotton plantations made possible by the labor of enslaved people to intensive Great Plains grain production, which led to the 1930s Dust Bowl, to water engineering projects that turned the California desert into one of the world's most productive regions. Large-scale agriculture, often for international export markets, is at the very heart of American history. The scale on which agricultural projects take place has ballooned since the 1950s. Today, the hallmarks of industrial crop production are as follows: the widespread use of chemical fertilizers, pesticides, irrigation, and machinery. Huge fields that are hundreds to hundreds of thousands of acres in size. A distinct lack of crop diversity or crop rotation, and a heavy reliance on fossil fuels. The image that probably comes to mind for industrial crops is one of vast acres of corn and soybeans in the Midwest, grown for animal feed, ethanol, and processed food. In truth, most crops in the US, from apples to zucchini, are grown with industrialized practices, treated more as outdoor factories than as a part of an ecosystem. The industrialization of agriculture artificially divorces two countering aspects of a naturally closed loop and renewable cycle: nature's reciprocal and balanced system, whereby crops feed animals and animal waste fertilize crops. What we have instead are depleted soils on one hand and toxically excessive animal waste on the other, both problems generated by commercial agriculture. The major problem with industrialized farming is that it's unsustainable. It relies heavily on finite resources, including fossil fuels and rapidly depleting water tables, and it negatively impacts the environment, which affects everything everywhere with real cost at all levels. Another thing worth mentioning is the impact of the use of synthetic fertilizer. Nitrogen is a key building block of life and a critical nutrient for plants and animals. Although nitrogen is abundant in the atmosphere as an inert gas, it must be fixed into a reactive form to be used by plant cells. Bacteria on the roots of legumes like peas and beans naturally fix atmospheric nitrogen into nutrients that can be taken by other plants. Until 1913, cultivating legumes, spreading manure and crop residues, as well as mining deposits of bird droppings were the primary ways to access nitrogen for farming. In that year, German scientists discovered a process to synthesize nitrogen from the air into synthetic ammonia, which could be used as fertilizer. Agriculture was no longer under the limitations of natural nitrogen fixing, and crop yields exploded, as did the global population. The increase in world population since 1913 has closely tracked the huge increase in fertilizer production by one estimate. A world without nitrogen fertilizer could sustain only 3.5 billion people, rather than the nearly 10 billion projected by 2050. And I have not even touched pesticides. Are you familiar with the concept colony collapse disorder and the effect it has on bee populations? Pesticides are non-discriminatory chemicals, meaning they impact both good bugs and bad ones alike. Neonicotinoids are a class of commonly used pesticides that have devastating effects on honeybees and other pollinating insects. Specifically, imidacloprid and clodinidin are known to cause symptoms in these insects such as memory loss, navigation disruption, paralysis, and death. In cases when the insects aren't killed or paralyzed, bees are unable to navigate their way back to the hive, causing the collapse of the colony. The ironic twist to this is that honeybees are responsible for pollinating our world's food supply, meaning the chemicals meant to protect food crops are actually hindering their growth in the first place. If you thought for a second that is all there is, think twice. Now I'm going to talk about dead zones. These zones are areas of large bodies of water, typically in the ocean, but also occasionally in lakes and even rivers, that do not have enough oxygen to support marine life. This cause of such hypoxic conditions, which is lacking oxygen, is usually eutrophication, an increase in chemical nutrients in the water, leading to excessive blooms of algae that deplete underwater oxygen levels. Nitrogen and phosphorus from agricultural runoff are the primary culprits of this, but sewage, vehicular and industrial emissions, and even natural factors also play a role in the development of dead zones. Dead zones occur around the world, but primarily near areas where heavy agricultural and industrial activities spill nutrients into the water and compromise its quality accordingly. A 2008 study found more than 400 dead zones worldwide. It is not true that animal farming is responsible for 80% of greenhouse gas emissions. Actually, agriculture as a whole, including livestock and crop production, is responsible for only 13.5% of all world greenhouse gases. The claim that livestock farming is responsible for 65% of all human-related emissions of nitrous oxide is utter nonsense. Yes, it is true that agriculture is responsible for the majority of nitrous oxide emissions. However, the biggest bulk of this comes from the application of synthetic fertilizers that ironically can be prevented by utilizing natural fertilizer from manure. Not only that, the amount of nitrous oxide gas emissions that come from animal farming is only just around 4 to 6%. The issue of farting cows that contribute to methane gas emissions can easily be addressed by simply letting them eat grass and roam freely. Pasture grass is rich in omega-3 fatty acids, as a matter of fact. As ruminants, cattle are designed to consume a variety of grasses found in pasture lands. Making them eat anything else, like grains, upsets the fermentation process in cows' rumen. A research from the University of Dublin has found that adding omega-3s in the form of fish oil to the diet of confined cows can reduce methane emissions. Interesting findings. Scientists working for Group Danone found that when cattle were on pasture in the spring, they were healthier. When they added omega-3 rich pasture grasses to their feed year-round, the cows not only released less methane gas, but also produced about 10% more milk. The cow's methane gas emissions are calculated by the University of Vermont, which analyzes the chemical composition of their milk through a process called chromatography. With the right pasture and a winter feed that simulates pasture, some farmers are seeing an 18% reduction in methane gas emissions. Not only that, the milk from these cows are far more superior than their counterparts. In conclusion, putting cows back on pasture where they belong makes for healthier and happier cows, healthier humans, and a healthier planet. This is all I have for this one, ladies and gentlemen. I thought about making it much shorter, but there's too much information out there that needed to be put into this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did and found it plenty informative. Until next time.